Up next, we have a speaker who began her working life as a waitress, went on to work in the community sector with homeless people, and then into the clothing industry. She represented workers in the textile clothing and footwear industry as an organiser, then as branch and national secretary of the Textile Clothing and Footwear Union of Australia. Representing her union nationally and internationally, she led campaigns to win world-leading rights for workers throughout clothing supply chains, some of Australia's and the world's most exploited workers. Following the amalgamation of two unions, she became Vice President of the CFMEU. Please welcome President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Michele O'Neill.
Hi, Tracy, and thanks very much for that introduction. And I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands we're on meeting today. I'm here in the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay all my respects to their elders past and present. It always was, and it always will be, Aboriginal land. And I also want to acknowledge and thank Comcare for focusing your conference this year on the critical issue of workplace sexual harassment. Australian women and many men are hoping that 2021 is remembered as a turning point on issues of workplace gendered violence and sexual harassment, because we should not have to wait for respect, safety and equity. It's an indictment on all of us that this turning point had to rely on a young woman revealing the trauma of an alleged workplace sexual assault in our nation's parliament, perpetrated and then covered up just metres away from the offices of our Prime Minister. Literally in the corridors of power, the place of legislative change. Brittany Higgins' courage in telling her story has definitely influenced positive change. But what does it say about our laws, our regulators, our systems of work and our culture that it took her story to bring this issue to prominence, when those of us in this room with real responsibilities and real regulatory powers had not managed to get this issue raised to the level of focus it so clearly deserves? Because this isn't a news story or an isolated event. Every day in every type of workplace and job, workers face the hazard of harassment and violence at work. Ms. Higgins has done her bit. Telling her story has changed the story, and many women are very thankful to her. But the hard work of reform, legislative protections and appropriate regulation now sits in the hands of many of us in this two-day forum. Women are used to the promise of positive change. In just over 2 years, it'll be the 40th anniversary of the Sex Discrimination Act, for whom we can thank, amongst others, another woman of courage, the late Susan Ryan. Rereading the then opposition speeches to Parliament, you would think that the most radical legislation in the world was being debated. Men and women were at risk. The family structure would fall. Workplaces would be unmanageable and the natural order would collapse. Well, that didn't happen. And while it was a huge step forward, that piece of legislation also didn't deliver the change that women, again this year, had to take to the streets to demand. Nearly 40 years later, we're still grappling with the lived experience of sexual harassment and gendered violence against so many women and girls at the workplace. It's a major issue and still grossly underreported. ACTU national workplace surveys have found 64% of women have personally experienced one or more forms of sexual harassment at some point in their lives. We know this is an issue that does not just affect women and is also considerable and rising reports amongst men. Our workplace health and safety survey this year of more than 30,000 people found a quarter of workers have experienced sexual harassment in the last 12 months. We found that younger women are more likely to experience gendered violence or sexual harassment, and sectors such as retail and health are particularly high-risk industries. We also know that nearly 40 years on from the Sex Discrimination Act, most women subject to sexual harassment never make a formal complaint. Their reasons include fear of losing their job, backlash from the perpetrator. They don't want to cause a problem at work or face negative consequences, and they don't have enough support. So while education and informing people about sexual harassment is important, It's also critical for us to realise that even when women know what sexual harassment is through their lived experience, they also shockingly know that the systems of work will not protect them and support them if they make a complaint. To really do something about sexual harassment and gendered violence at work, we need to tackle the bigger task of gender inequality across our society. Australia still has a gender pay gap of over 14% and over 30% if the actual working hours are factored in. The government's own Workplace Gender Equality Agency statistics tell us that the gender pay gap has actually increased over the past year. Industries which predominantly employ women have high levels of award dependency, lower wages, more insecure jobs, and fewer protections. These industries include the frontline workers who literally carried our community through the pandemic. We have one of the highest rates of insecure work in the OECD. In Australia, unpaid care and domestic work between men and women is one of the most unequal in the world. We've got one of the least generous paid parental schemes in the OECD, coupled with one of the most expensive and inaccessible early childhood education and care systems. Between 2006 and 2020, Australia plummeted from 15th to 44th place in the World Economic Forum Gender Gap Report. This is the context in which gender-based violence and sexual harassment at work occurs. The change required is fundamental and complex. It's critical that sexual harassment and gendered violence are addressed as serious workplace health and safety issues by our regulatory framework. But the answer does not lie with the Work Health and Safety regime on its own. The Sex Discrimination Act and the Fair Work Act have important and interconnected roles to play. Fortunately, the way forward's been mapped out for us by two key federal government reports. In 2018, the Boland review of our work health and safety laws found they are inadequate for dealing with psychosocial hazards and injuries, including sexual harassment and gendered violence. The report also found the regulation covering notifiable incidents does not cover sexual harassment or assault. The Boland review recommended changes to legislation and to regulation to address these unacceptable gaps in our laws. And in January of 2020, the Respect at Work report was delivered to the then Attorney General, Christian Porter. The report was comprehensive, well-researched, and delivered 55 practical recommendations for reform. That report found sexual harassment to be prevalent and pervasive across all workplaces. It also found, like Boland, that the current legal and regulatory framework was failing. The strength of the Respect at Work recommendations is that they understand that sexual harassment and gendered violence at work flourishes because gender inequality is ignored, not understood, or not seen as a priority. It's not a case of a few bad apples, but underlying cultural and structural issues. And firing or disciplining perpetrators will not by itself change the statistics. We need to ensure that women have a safe system of work and that employers take active steps to ensure workers are protected from sexual harassment and gendered violence. Kate Jenkins' key regulatory reform recommendations included changes to the Sex Discrimination Act that would require employers to have a positive duty to take preventative measures to address sexual harassment, rather than simply relying on individual complaints. Changes to the Fair Work Act to explicitly prohibit sexual harassment and provide an enforceable right for victims of sexual harassment in the workplace. An amendment to the model WHS regulation to deal with psychological health as recommended by the Boland Review, and new guidelines on sexual harassment to inform the development of a WHS code of practice on sexual harassment. I want to tell you the story of a young supermarket worker. I'm calling her Sandy. The policy at her workplace is for staff to park at the far end of the car park because the closest car parks are for the customers. She regularly finishes her shift at midnight and walks to her car alone. A group of young men also regularly hang out in the car park and yell sexualised comments to her on her way to her car. The last time she walked to her car, one of the young men ran towards her and threw something at her. She feels unsafe, on edge, and anxious now every night as she's working towards the end of that late shift. She starts to make mistakes and in fact cuts herself one night with a box cutter while opening stock to put on the shelves. She's reprimanded by her supervisor for not paying attention and making mistakes. And she tells the supervisor what's worrying her. And he tells her not to worry about it. Those young men are just mucking around and to just get over it. This is not just Sandy's story. It's emblematic of the stories told to unions around the country every day. And it's why unions have said that the federal government's minimalist legislative change in its response to the Respect at Work report is not enough. We believe that a positive duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment is critically important and that the Sex Discrimination Act must be amended to require employers to take reasonable and proportionate steps to eliminate sexual harassment and discrimination where possible, taking into account the size of the business. This would complement and build on workplace health and safety duties with a specific focus on sexual harassment. Work's underway through Safe Work Australia to develop a new regulation, as we've heard, addressing psychosocial hazards, as well as improvements to the triggers for incidents at work, including sexual harassment. Safe Work Australia released new guidelines on preventing sexual harassment earlier this year, and these guidelines must now inform the development of a code of practice on sexual harassment, as recommended by Kate Jenkins. Sandy's story shows how the response to the hazard requires positive action by the employer to know and understand the hazard and to control the hazard appropriately. But it also shows the need to take steps to address the underlying causes of sexual harassment at work: gender inequality, discrimination, and power imbalances. Unless employers take both a work health and safety approach and an anti-discrimination approach to addressing the problem of sexual harassment, the problem will persist in Australian workplaces. This was a central finding of the Jenkins report. In addition, our industrial laws must respond to sexual harassment effectively, and we support the changes that were proposed by Kate Jenkins to the Fair Work Act to explicitly prohibit sexual harassment and discrimination and to provide a quick and easy Fair Work complaints process. Today we see the commencement of Stop Sexual Harassment orders in the Fair Work Commission. This is a step forward, but leaves significant gaps in what is required and what was recommended in Respect at Work. Other critically important Respect at Work recommendations have also been ignored by the government. They include amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act to empower the Sex Discrimination Commissioner to initiate her own inquiries. She should not have had to wait to be invited by the Prime Minister to look at what was happening inside Parliament House. Changing the objects of the Sex Discrimination Act to achieve substantive equality between women and men. Women need equality of outcomes, not just lip service to equality of opportunities. And increasing access to justice for victims by allowing unions and other representative groups to bring claims to court and ensuring costs are only awarded against a party if it acted vexatiously or without cause. And I want to put on the table one issue which was outside the scope of Respect at Work, but absolutely vital to gender equity at work and keeping women safe: paid family and domestic violence leave. It's now a decade since the Australian Services Union won the very first workplace agreement that included paid leave in the world. Since then, union campaigning and bargaining in Australia has won that right in over 1 in 3 of our workplaces across the country. This is a tremendous effort from all of us, but too many workers are still left out. And we know that despite our progress, the pandemic has made family and domestic violence worse. Police and frontline support services recorded a surge in cases last year. We're calling on all sides of politics to include a minimum of 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave in the National Employment Standards. Paid family and domestic violence leave literally saves lives, as well as helps to build safe and inclusive workplaces. I shouldn't really need to say this, but safe and healthy workplaces for all, and in this context for women and girls, is not only good for our community, but it's good for productivity, it's good for business, and it's good for the economy. Making all the changes recommended by the Respect at Work report would be the appropriate legislative and regulatory response to the demands we have heard loud and clear after Ms Higgins told her story. Some good work is underway at the state level, and I have to call out WorkSafe Victoria's Prevention of Gendered Violence Guide for Employers and the award-winning Australian Services Union Workplace Guides in New South Wales. But have no doubt, the union movement will continue to campaign to win the structural changes that are necessary. Every single one of those 55 recommendations needs to be acted on. Every one of the legislative and regulatory changes must be implemented. Finally, I want to talk about the scourge of insecure work. Our health and safety laws, our industrial relations laws, and our discrimination laws were largely based at the time on full-time and permanent forms of employment. The rise of insecure forms of work and the separation between workers and their employers by use of forms of employment like labour hire, contracting out, and the so-called gig economy put workers at risk and are a threat to our existing regulatory functions and the compensation schemes that seek to look after injured workers. Ensuring work doesn't hurt people or leave them physically or psychologically damaged and unable to work is our responsibility. Insecure forms of work damages people, their families, and their communities. Their insecurity is more than financial. They're also limited in their access to the systems that would protect them with basic human and workplace rights. Unreliable pay means a more stressful and unreliable life. People who have insecure jobs are less safe at work because they're less secure. They're more likely to be sexually harassed, more likely to suffer a workplace injury, and more likely to experience wage theft. This is an issue of basic dignity and respect. Workers deserve better job security and the financial security that comes with it. The laws need to change. And of course, insecure work dominates industries that are dominated by women. To go back to where I started this speech, sexual harassment and gendered violence at the workplace is a result of gender inequality. And while events in 2021 have led to some action and given us some hope, we also see distressing signs of growing economic inequality. Researchers at the University of Sydney say that Australia has one of the most gender segregated workforces in the OECD, made worse by the pandemic. Of the 800,000 workers who lost their jobs between March and May last year, women made up 54%. We know that breaks in labour force participation have what researchers call lasting wage scarring effects, and it's worse for women. There's no question that the interruptions for work from COVID will have long-term impacts on women and make existing inequalities worse. Women retire with 47% less superannuation than men. Without changes to our laws, at the current rate of change, it will take women about 50 years to achieve equal pay. I hope not to be working then. Even with the best workplace health and safety laws and regulatory practices in the world, if insecure forms of work continue to grow, we'll not see the statistics on sexual harassment and gendered violence at work improve. But health and safety laws and regulations are a crucial place to make and lead change. Sexual harassment and gendered violence must be addressed as serious work health and safety issues. We need to ensure regulators like yourselves have the tools necessary to make changes that protect workers. Safer workplaces for women, for girls, and indeed for every worker is surely one of the marks of a decent, fair and modern society. Women in Australia are not unsafe because they are inherently risky or innately dangerous. Women are not safe because they are not equal, and they'll not be safe until they are equal. Women will not accidentally become more safe or more equal. Structural problems require structural solutions, and structural solutions require leadership. I commend the work that you all do in striving to make the changes needed on this critical issue, by educating, by organising, by informing, by regulating, and by prosecuting. Every worker, every day, deserves to be safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michele, for your strong words today. You covered a lot of different areas there. What is the one thing that you would like participants today to walk away with, to think, this is the one thing I can do to help reduce workplace sexual harassment?
I think the one thing that people should do is act. and I don't say that lightly. I think that one of the things that we all experience in the history of trying to deal with sexual harassment is that sense of paralysis. And it stems firstly often from the person who's being harassed, feeling paralysed in terms of their action and their capacity to be able to act. And then it spreads through people who might have witnessed it, those that might be responsible, those that haven't acted to take preventative action. And of course, it keeps going, Tracy, because if it's your job and your responsibility to advise and take steps to ensure legislative change, then that's urgent action that's needed too. And if you're a legislator, then you've got to act to deliver on those 55 recommendations. So we all engage in different ways. And of course, I also know there's union organisers on the line here today as well. And there's employers on the line. So we all have responsibility to act, to not let this be any longer something that's swept under the carpet. And we act in different ways, but the sense of urgency for our action and to take responsibility is key for everyone.
How can we more deeply embed consent, training and education from the schoolyard to the workplace and deeply within the policy framework?
Well, I think there is a really important role for education around consent, and that does start absolutely at the schoolyard and in the home. And I think it also goes to my point about gender inequality and understanding power. So the notion that that you have a right, whoever you are, whatever gender you are, that you have a right to say no. That you have a right to be treated with respect and dignity, and that even those people who may be older than you or be in positions of power compared to you have no agency or right to actually act in a way that is outside your consent, is something that we need to understand much more broadly and effectively than we do now. And that does start at childhood, doesn't it? It's about that fundamental notion about our right to control what happens to our own bodies and for people not to infringe on that, but also our right, not just in terms of physical assault or harassment, but of course our right as people to be treated with respect and not be demeaned or diminished by how people speak to us as well. So it's such a big need for change in terms of understanding of consent. It's so ingrained. You know, I get shocked when I see those statistics, particularly about attitudes of young people about what isn't okay when they're just starting out in terms of relationships, and it shows we have so far to go on this. But I think we can model some of this in workplaces, because in some ways it's a more regulated environment. So having very clear understanding in policy, in training, and in requirements and expectations in the workplace about what is and isn't okay, and leadership in terms of calling that out and changing behaviour and acting with consequence when people go outside of that is critical.
President of the ACTU, Michele O'Neill, thank you so much for your time.